November 1944, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The frozen mud clung to Private First Class Robert Hansen's boots as he crouched behind a shattered oak tree, his M-one Garand clutched against his chest. Somewhere in the dense fog ahead, German machine gun fire ripped through the morning silence. His squad had been pinned down for 40 minutes. 3 men were already dead. The forest floor was a maze of shell craters and fallen timber, each shadow a potential threat. Hansen pressed his back against the tree bark, breathing hard, counting his remaining clips. 8 rounds per clip. 6 clips left. Not enough. Never enough in this cursed forest where every tree hid death and every advance cost blood. What Hansen did not know, what none of the American soldiers fighting through those dark woods understood, was that the rifle in his hands, the weapon that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, had almost never existed. The M-one Garand, the semi-automatic rifle that would fire over 4 million rounds in this war, had been dismissed as impossible to manufacture, rejected by military boards, and nearly abandoned by the very government that now depended on it for survival. The man who designed it had been told his dream was unmakeable, his vision impractical, his ambition foolish. But John Cantius Garand, a quiet immigrant from Quebec who barely spoke English when he arrived in America, had refused to accept defeat, and his refusal would change warfare forever. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not in the forests of Europe, but in the frozen farmlands of Quebec, Canada, where John Cantius Garand was born on January 1st, 1888, in the small village of Saint-Rémy, about 30 miles south of Montreal. His father, Hürtgen Forest, worked a modest farm that barely sustained the family through the brutal Canadian winters. His mother, Lucia, raised 11 children in a cramped farmhouse where warmth came from a single wood stove and education was a luxury few could afford. Young Jean, called John after his family immigrated to the United States, showed an unusual aptitude for mechanical work from an early age. While his brothers focused on farm labor, John spent hours studying the simple machines around him. The plow mechanisms, the well pump, the door hinges. Everything fascinated him. How did things work? How could they work better? His father noticed this curiosity but saw no practical future in it. Farmers needed strong backs, not curious minds. But John's mother recognized something different in her son. She encouraged his questions, saved small amounts of money for basic tools, and told him that in America, a man with skills could build a different life. In 1902, when John was 14 years old, the Garand family made the decision that thousands of Quebec families were making. They would leave Canada for the industrial opportunities of New England. The textile mills of Connecticut and Rhode Island were hiring. The factories promised steady wages, something farming could never guarantee. The family crossed the border with their belongings packed in 2 trunks and their hopes tied to the promise of American prosperity. They settled in Jewett City, Connecticut, a small mill town on the Quebec River. The town's population was barely 3,000 people, but it had something the Quebec countryside lacked: factories, machines, and opportunities for a boy who understood how things worked. John's father found work at a textile mill. His older brothers joined him on the factory floor. But John, still young and small for heavy factory labor, found different work. He became an apprentice at a local machine shop. The Jewett City Machine Company was a modest operation, serving the textile mills with repair work and custom parts. The shop owner, a German immigrant named Friedrich Brenner, recognized talent when he saw it. Young John Garand might not speak English well, but he could read a technical drawing, operate a lathe, and understand tolerances better than men twice his age. Brenner took John under his guidance, teaching him the precise crafts of machining, how to read micrometers, how to hold tolerances to thousandths of an inch, how to select the right metal for each application. John absorbed everything. He worked 12-hour days in the shop, then spent his evenings sketching mechanical improvements in notebooks. His English remained poor, heavily accented, but the language of machines was universal. By 1907, at age 19, John Garand had become one of the most skilled machinists in Jewett City. He could fabricate parts for textile equipment, repair broken machinery, and even design improvements to existing mechanisms. But the textile industry did not challenge him. He wanted to work on something more sophisticated, more important, something that mattered. His opportunity came through an unexpected source: sport shooting. In rural New England, hunting and target shooting were common recreations. John began attending local shooting competitions, not as a competitor, but as a curious observer. He studied the rifles the shooters used, bolt-action designs mostly. Winchester, Remington, Mauser. Each shot required the shooter to manually operate the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round. This seemed inefficient to John. Why should a shooter waste time and motion operating a bolt? Why couldn't the rifle use the energy from firing to automatically chamber the next round? Semi-automatic operation was not a new concept. Hiram Maxim had invented the fully automatic machine gun in 1884. John Browning had designed several semi-automatic pistols and a semi-automatic shotgun, but semi-automatic rifles remained rare and unreliable. The technical challenges were substantial. A rifle cartridge generated far more pressure than a pistol round. The mechanism had to withstand this force, while reliably extracting the spent case, ejecting it, and chambering a fresh round. The mechanism had to function in mud, rain, and extreme temperatures. It had to be durable enough for military use. And, critically for military adoption, it had to be manufacturable at scale with 1910s-era machinery. Most designers focused on complex mechanisms with multiple moving parts. John Garand thought differently. Simplicity, he believed, was the key to reliability. Fewer parts meant fewer failure points. Fewer parts meant easier manufacturing. Fewer parts meant soldiers could maintain the weapon in field conditions. In 1909, at age 21, John began sketching his first rifle design. He worked in the evenings after his shifts at the machine shop, filling notebooks with drawings and calculations. He had no formal engineering education, no connections to firearms manufacturers, no funding for prototypes. He had only his skill, his conviction, and an immigrant's stubborn refusal to accept limitations. By 1912, John had completed his first working prototype. Built entirely in his spare time, with tools borrowed from the machine shop, the rifle used a simple gas-operated mechanism. When fired, a small amount of propellant gas was diverted through a port in the barrel. This gas pushed against a piston, which drove the bolt carrier rearward, extracting and ejecting the spent case. A spring then pushed the bolt carrier forward, stripping a fresh cartridge from the magazine and chambering it. The entire cycle took a fraction of a second. The shooter simply pulled the trigger again. The design was crude, unreliable, and far from ready for production. But it worked sometimes. John knew he needed better facilities, better tools, and access to manufacturing expertise. In 1913, he left Jewett City for New York, where he found work at a precision machine shop in the Bronx. The shop produced components for various industries, including some firearms parts. Here, John refined his design. He learned about metallurgy, heat treating, and spring dynamics. He built a second prototype, then a third. Each version was more reliable than the last. Then came 1914, and everything changed. War erupted in Europe. The Great War, as it would be called, introduced industrial-scale slaughter. Machine guns dominated the battlefield. Millions of men with bolt-action rifles charged into machine gun fire and died by the hundreds of thousands. The war demonstrated that modern combat demanded higher rates of fire. European armies began experimenting with semi-automatic rifles. The French developed the Meunier rifle. The Germans tested the Mondragon. The British evaluated several designs. None proved satisfactory for mass production and field use. The United States, still neutral in 1914, watched these developments with interest. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Department, responsible for weapons procurement, began considering whether American forces needed a semi-automatic rifle. Most senior officers were skeptical. The bolt-action Springfield Model 1903 rifle was accurate, reliable, and proven. Why replace it with complex, unproven semi-automatic designs? But a few forward-thinking officers recognized that if America entered the European war, soldiers would need every advantage. Higher rates of accurate fire could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. In 1916, the Ordnance Department issued a formal request for semi-automatic rifle designs. John Garand, working in his Bronx machine shop, learned about this request through trade publications. Here was his chance. He submitted drawings and specifications for his design. The Ordnance Department received over 40 submissions from various inventors and manufacturers. Most were rejected immediately as impractical or based on unproven concepts. A handful, including Garand's, were selected for further evaluation. In April 1917, the United States entered World War I. The need for effective infantry weapons became urgent. The Ordnance Department accelerated its semi-automatic rifle program. John Garand received a letter requesting that he build a working prototype for testing at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. Springfield Armory, established in 1794, was the United States Army's primary firearms development and manufacturing facility. Located in Springfield, Massachusetts, the Armory employed hundreds of skilled gunsmiths and machinists. It had produced millions of muskets, rifles, and pistols over its history. It was also deeply conservative in its approach to firearms design. The master gunsmiths at Springfield had perfected the bolt-action Springfield Model 1903 rifle. They understood its every dimension, every tolerance, every manufacturing requirement. They were deeply skeptical of semi-automatic designs, which they viewed as overly complex, unreliable, and difficult to manufacture. When John Garand arrived at Springfield Armory in June 1917, carrying his prototype in a wooden case, he faced a room full of skeptics. The evaluation board consisted of 5 Army officers and 3 civilian firearms experts. Major James Thompson, who would later develop the Thompson submachine gun, led the board. Garand spoke nervously in heavily accented English, explaining his design's operating principles. He demonstrated the rifle's function, field stripping it to show the simplicity of its mechanism. The board members examined the prototype, asked technical questions, and took notes. Then they tested the rifle on the Armory's firing range. The prototype functioned reasonably well for the first 30 rounds. Then it jammed. Garand quickly cleared the jam and continued firing. 20 rounds later, another jam. The test continued through 200 rounds with multiple malfunctions. Major Thompson thanked Garand politely and dismissed him. The board's verdict was predictable. The design showed promise but was not ready for military adoption. The mechanism needed refinement. The reliability was unacceptable for combat use. Most critically, the rifle would be extremely difficult to manufacture with existing machinery and methods. John Garand returned to New York, discouraged but not defeated. The board had not rejected his design outright. They had said it needed refinement. Very well, he would refine it. But he faced a significant problem. Refining the design required extensive testing, which required ammunition, range time, and machining facilities. All of this cost money. Garand's savings were nearly depleted. He took a job at a munitions plant in New Jersey, working the night shift so he could spend his days working on the rifle design. The work was exhausting. 12 hours on the factory floor, then 6 or 8 hours in a rented workshop, machining parts, testing modifications, and filling notebooks with calculations. His health suffered, his weight dropped, his hands developed a permanent tremor from exhaustion and the constant vibration of machine tools. But the rifle improved. By early 1918, he had eliminated most of the jamming problems. He had simplified the gas system. He had improved the magazine design. In March 1918, he returned to Springfield Armory with an improved prototype. This time, the rifle functioned through 500 rounds with only 2 minor malfunctions. The evaluation board was impressed, but still not convinced. They raised a new objection: manufacturing complexity. The rifle's parts required tolerances and machining operations that would be extremely expensive to produce at scale. One board member, a civilian engineer from Winchester Repeating Arms, estimated that Garand's rifle would cost 3 to 4 times as much to manufacture as a bolt-action Springfield. In wartime, cost mattered. The army needed millions of rifles. If each rifle cost 3 times as much, the total expenditure would be enormous. The board thanked Garand again and told him to continue refinement with an emphasis on manufacturability. The war ended in November 1918, before any semi-automatic rifle could be adopted. The urgency disappeared. The army reverted to peacetime priorities, which emphasized budget constraints over innovation. The semi-automatic rifle program was reduced to minimal funding. Most designers gave up and returned to other work. John Garand did not give up. In January 1919, he made a bold decision. He would move to Springfield, Massachusetts, and seek employment at Springfield Armory. If he could work inside the armory, he would have access to the best tools, the most knowledgeable gunsmiths, and the opportunity to prove his design's worth. He applied for a position as a consulting engineer. The armory's superintendent, General C.C. Williams, remembered the persistent immigrant who had submitted the promising but flawed semi-automatic rifle. Williams recognized dedication when he saw it. In April 1919, John Garand joined Springfield Armory as a junior engineer at a salary of $2,400 per year. It was more money than Garand had ever earned. More importantly, it was access. Access to the finest machine shops in America, access to unlimited ammunition for testing, access to the accumulated knowledge of master gunsmiths who had been building rifles for decades. Garand threw himself into the work. He was assigned to the Armory's experimental shop where new designs were prototyped and tested. His official duties involved assisting senior engineers with various projects, but everyone knew his real focus was his semi-automatic rifle. The Armory's culture was hierarchical and traditional. Senior engineers, many of them West Point graduates, did not easily accept advice from a self-taught immigrant machinist. Garand's broken English made communication difficult. His lack of formal education made him suspect in their eyes. His single-minded focus on the semi-automatic rifle seemed obsessive. But Garand had one advantage. He could build things. While other engineers drew designs and wrote specifications, Garand machined actual parts, assembled actual prototypes, and conducted actual tests. He would arrive at the shop at 6 in the morning, hours before his shift began. He would work through lunch. He would stay until 8 or 9 at night. On weekends, he would come in and work alone in the silent shop, the only sounds, the whir of lathes and the rasp of files. His colleagues thought him strange, obsessed, perhaps a bit mad. They called him the crazy Canuck behind his back, but they could not deny his skill or his progress. Between 1919 and 1924, Garand built and tested over 30 prototype variations. Each addressed specific problems identified in previous tests. Extraction reliability improved, gas system efficiency improved, parts durability improved, magazine capacity increased from 5 rounds to 8 rounds, then to 10 rounds. The rifle evolved from a crude prototype into an increasingly refined weapon. But one problem remained stubbornly unsolved: manufacturing cost. The rifle still required machining operations that were time-consuming and expensive. In 1924, the Army conducted a formal competition to select a semi-automatic rifle for potential adoption. 21 designs were submitted from various manufacturers and independent inventors. Garand's design was among them. The testing was rigorous. Each rifle had to fire 10,000 rounds without critical failure. Each had to function in mud, sand, rain, and extreme temperatures. Each had to be field-stripped and reassembled by average soldiers with minimal training. Each had to demonstrate acceptable accuracy at ranges up to 600 yards. And each had to present a realistic path to affordable mass production. The competition lasted 8 months. Most designs failed early. Rifles that worked well in controlled conditions jammed in mud or rain. Rifles that were reliable were too complex for field maintenance. Rifles that were simple lacked the durability for sustained firing. By early 1925, only 3 designs remained under consideration. Garand's rifle, a design from John Pedersen, another Springfield Armory engineer, and a design submitted by Winchester Repeating Arms. The Pedersen rifle was technically sophisticated, but extremely complex. It used a toggle lock mechanism with over 60 separate parts. The Winchester design was simpler, but used a less reliable blowback operation. Garand's design sat in the middle, more complex than the Winchester, simpler than the Pedersen. The evaluation board could not reach consensus. Some members favored the Pedersen rifle's sophisticated engineering. Others preferred the Winchester design's simplicity. A few supported Garand's design as the best compromise. The board requested additional testing. This decision frustrated Garand deeply. Years of work, 30 prototypes, 10,000 test rounds, and still no decision. He was now 37 years old. He had devoted 15 years to this rifle. His health was poor from overwork. His personal life was non-existent. He had never married, had no children, few friends outside the armory. His entire existence revolved around making this rifle work. Colleagues urged him to move on. The competition was political now, they said. The army might never adopt any semi-automatic rifle. He was wasting his talent on an impossible dream. But John Garand had not come to America, had not taught himself engineering, had not spent 15 years perfecting a design just to abandon it because of politics. He returned to his workshop and began the most radical redesign yet. The problem was manufacturing cost. Very well, he would redesign every component with manufacturing in mind. Complex forgings became simple stampings. Machined parts became cast parts that required minimal finishing. Multi-step operations became single-step operations. The rifle's appearance began to change. Gone were the refined curves and complex shapes. The new design looked blocky, utilitarian, almost crude, but it could be manufactured efficiently with existing machinery. In 1928, Garand submitted his redesigned rifle for evaluation. The Army tested it alongside the Pedersen and Winchester designs, both of which had also been refined. The testing lasted 6 months. In January 1929, the Army Ordnance Department made its decision. None of the 3 designs were acceptable for immediate adoption. However, the Garand design showed the most promise for further development. John Garand was directed to continue refinement with focus on reliability and manufacturability. John Pedersen's design was rejected as too complex and expensive. Winchester was thanked for its participation and dismissed. For Garand, this was both victory and frustration. His design had been selected, but not adopted. The Army wanted further refinement. How much further? How many more years? He was 41 years old now. How many more prototypes would he build before seeing his rifle in soldiers' hands? The answer would take another 7 years. Throughout the 1930s, as the world slid toward another global war, John Garand continued refining his rifle. He tested different gas port sizes, different spring rates, different bolt designs. He worked with metallurgists to develop steel alloys that could withstand the stresses of semi-automatic operation. He collaborated with production engineers to simplify manufacturing processes. The work was methodical, exhausting, and seemingly endless. Each improvement solved one problem, but often created another. Stronger springs improved reliability, but made the rifle harder to operate. Larger gas ports increased cycling power, but accelerated barrel wear. Every design choice involved trade-offs. Meanwhile, the world changed around him. The stock market crashed in 1929, plunging America into the Great Depression. Springfield Armory's budget was slashed. Several engineers were laid off. Garand kept his position, but saw his already modest salary reduced. He continued working, driven not by money, but by conviction. In Europe, Hitler rose to power in Germany in 1933. Mussolini ruled Italy. Japan invaded Manchuria. The world was arming for another war. American military leaders began to understand that the next conflict would require modern weapons. The bolt-action Springfield rifle, excellent as it was, belonged to the previous war's technology. By 1935, Garand's rifle had evolved into a weapon that balanced reliability, manufacturability, and combat effectiveness. The gas system was refined to provide consistent cycling across wide ammunition variations. The operating rod design was strengthened to withstand sustained firing. The trigger mechanism was improved for smoother, more predictable pull. The rifle weighed 9.5 pounds, held 8 rounds in an internal magazine, and could fire accurately to 600 yards. In July 1936, after nearly 25 years of development, the United States Army formally adopted the Garand rifle as the M1. John Cantius Garand, the immigrant machinist who had been told his dream was impossible, had succeeded. His rifle became the United States Army's standard infantry weapon. But adoption was just the beginning. Now came the real test: manufacturing. Springfield Armory had the capacity to produce perhaps 20,000 rifles per year. The Army needed hundreds of thousands, eventually millions. Could the M-one Garand be manufactured at that scale? The production engineers who had been skeptical about the rifle's complexity now faced the task of actually making it in massive quantities. They developed specialized tooling, streamlined assembly procedures, and trained hundreds of new workers in the precise operations required. The first production rifles rolled off the line in late 1937. Production ramped up slowly. 5,000 rifles in 1938, 15,000 in 1939, 35,000 in 1940. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. America was at war. Suddenly the Army needed M-one Garand rifles, not by the thousands, but by the millions. Springfield Armory could not produce them fast enough. The Army contracted with Winchester Repeating Arms to manufacture additional rifles. The production targets were staggering: 100,000 rifles per month, then 200,000 per month. The manufacturing challenges multiplied. Steel shortages forced changes to some components. New workers, many of them women, had to be trained in precision operations they had never performed. Quality control became critical as production accelerated. And through it all, John Garand remained at Springfield Armory, now as the chief engineer of the rifle division. Every production problem, every field malfunction, every performance issue came across his desk. He was 53 years old when the war began, too old for military service. But he worked harder than soldiers half his age. 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days per week. When production problems arose, he would go to the factory floor, work alongside the machinists and assemblers, identify the issue, and develop solutions. When field reports came back describing malfunctions in jungle humidity or Arctic cold, he would return to his workshop and test modifications. The M-one Garand went to war in 1942, carried by American soldiers landing in North Africa, fighting in the Pacific Islands, preparing for the eventual invasion of Europe. And in those first battles, the rifle proved everything John Garand had promised 25 years earlier. It was reliable, durable, and devastatingly effective. American infantrymen could fire 8 aimed shots as quickly as they could pull the trigger. German and Japanese soldiers, still armed with bolt-action rifles, had to manually cycle their actions between shots. In close-quarters combat, this difference meant life or death. An American rifleman could engage multiple targets before an enemy soldier could fire his second shot. The psychological impact was profound. Enemy soldiers learned to fear the distinctive ping sound the M1 made when its empty clip ejected. That ping meant an American rifleman needed 2 seconds to reload. German infantry were trained to rush American positions when they heard that sound. But 8-round clips meant American squads maintained continuous fire even as individual rifles reloaded. General George Patton called the M-one Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. Whether that was hyperbole or truth, it captured how American commanders viewed the weapon. It gave their infantry a significant advantage in firepower. The rifle that had been dismissed as unmakeable was now being manufactured at a rate of 400,000 per year. Springfield Armory and Winchester together would eventually produce over 4 million M-one Garand rifles before the war ended. 4 million copies of a design one man had perfected through sheer determination. But for John Garand, vindication came with an unexpected cost. In 1942, as the first M-one Garand rifles reached American soldiers fighting in the Solomon Islands, and North Africa, John Garand received a letter from the United States Patent Office. The letter informed him that his patent application for the M1 rifle design, filed years earlier, had been approved. Patent number 2,324,185 was now officially registered in his name. The letter also included a standard notification. As a government employee working on a government project, all rights to the patent automatically transferred to the United States government. John Garand would receive no royalties, no licensing fees, no financial compensation beyond his regular salary for a design that would generate billions of dollars in manufacturing contracts. He read the letter twice, then filed it away in a desk drawer. He had known this would be the outcome. Government employment contracts were clear on intellectual property rights. Anything developed on government time, using government resources, belonged to the government. But knowing did not make it easier to accept. Private inventors who licensed designs to the military often became wealthy. John Browning had earned millions from his firearms patents. Hiram Maxim had built a fortune from machine gun royalties. John Garand would earn his regular salary of $4,600 per year. His colleagues at Springfield Armory were outraged on his behalf. The man had devoted 25 years to perfecting this rifle. He had sacrificed his health, his personal life, his youth. Now, his design was generating enormous profits for Winchester and other contractors, while he received nothing. Several sympathetic officers suggested Garand request special compensation from Congress. The precedent existed. Congress had occasionally awarded special payments to inventors whose work proved particularly valuable to national defense. But John Garand refused to pursue this option. He had not designed the rifle for money, he explained. He had designed it because American soldiers needed a better weapon. If the rifle helped win the war and brought soldiers home alive, that was compensation enough. His colleagues thought him naive, perhaps even foolish. But Garand's perspective came from a different place. He remembered being a poor immigrant boy in Quebec, remembered arriving in America with nothing, remembered the opportunities this country had given him. America had allowed him to learn, to work, to create. The rifle was his way of repaying that debt. The irony was not lost on him. He had been rejected, dismissed, and told his design was impossible by the very institution that now depended on it. But he held no bitterness. Bureaucracies were slow. He understood that. Innovation always faced resistance. What mattered was that the rifle worked, that soldiers trusted it, that it helped win battles. Throughout 1943 and 1944, as American forces pushed across the Pacific and prepared for the invasion of Europe, field reports about the M-one Garand flooded back to Springfield Armory. The reports were overwhelmingly positive, but they also identified problems that needed addressing. In the humid jungles of New Guinea and Guadalcanal, some rifles developed rust in the gas system. Garand worked with metallurgists to develop improved corrosion-resistant coatings. In the frozen forests of the Aleutian Islands, lubricants thickened in extreme cold, causing malfunctions. Garand tested different lubricant formulations and issued new maintenance guidelines. In the desert fighting of North Africa, sand infiltration caused extraction failures. Garand designed modified dust covers and improved tolerances in critical areas. Each problem received his personal attention. He would read the field report, often just a few sentences, scrawled by a sergeant or lieutenant describing a malfunction. Then he would spend days or weeks recreating the conditions, testing solutions, and implementing fixes. Production rifles were continuously improved based on these field lessons. The M-one Garand that landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, was a more refined weapon than the rifle that had fought at Guadalcanal in 1942. By mid-1944, the accumulated modifications had created a rifle of remarkable reliability. Soldiers learned to trust it completely. Unlike bolt-action rifles that required careful manipulation between shots, the M-one simply worked. Pull the trigger, the rifle fired, and automatically chambered the next round. The simplicity of operation meant soldiers could focus on tactics and marksmanship rather than mechanical manipulation. First Sergeant James Rodriguez, fighting with the 1st Infantry Division in France, later described the difference the M1 made in combat. With the old Springfield bolt action, he explained, you thought about working the bolt, you thought about extraction and chambering, you thought about the mechanics. With the M1, you just thought about the target. The rifle became invisible. It simply did what you needed it to do. This was exactly what John Garand had envisioned 25 years earlier, when he first sketched a gas-operated rifle in a notebook. A weapon so reliable, so intuitive, that soldiers could trust it without thinking. The November 1944 fighting in Hürtgen Forest demonstrated the M1's value under the worst possible conditions. The forest was a nightmarish landscape of mud, rain, shattered trees, and concealed German positions. Visibility was measured in yards. Firefights erupted at ranges so close soldiers could see their enemies' faces. In this environment, rate of fire meant everything. American infantry units armed with M-one Garands could sustain firepower that German units with Mauser bolt-action rifles could not match. The casualty rates were horrific on both sides, but American units maintained offensive momentum despite German defensive advantages. Company commanders reported that in close-quarters forest fighting, American squads consistently outfought German squads of equal size. The semi-automatic rifle gave American infantry a firepower edge that compensated for German advantages in terrain and defensive preparation. Lieutenant Paul Hayes, leading a rifle platoon in Hürtgen, wrote in a letter home that became part of the Army's historical record, "The Krauts have good soldiers and good positions, but our rifle is better than theirs. In a straight-up fight at close range, we win because we can shoot faster and keep shooting." It sounds simple, but simple things matter when men are dying. Simple things matter. John Garand had built his entire design philosophy on that principle. Simplicity led to reliability. Reliability led to trust. Trust led to effectiveness. As 1945 began and Allied forces prepared for the final offensives against Germany and Japan, the strategic importance of the M-one Garand became clear in military planning. American infantry divisions could conduct more aggressive tactics because their riflemen possessed superior firepower. This influenced everything from squad-level maneuvers to division-scale operations. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in Europe, specifically noted in his operational planning that American infantry's firepower advantage allowed for faster advances and more aggressive exploitation of breakthroughs. This was not solely because of the M-one Garand, but the rifle was a significant factor. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, American forces had carried M-one Garand rifles from North Africa to Germany, from Sicily to Austria. The rifle had fought in every climate, every terrain, every condition the European theater could present. It had proven durable enough for the Russian winter, reliable enough for the Italian mud, and effective enough for the hedgerows of France. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the war was over. John Garand was 57 years old. He had spent 28 years developing and refining the rifle that now bore his name. He had worked through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and countless technical setbacks. He had been rejected, dismissed, and told his dream was impossible, but he had persevered, and his perseverance had armed American soldiers with a weapon that gave them a measurable advantage in combat. The question that haunted him in the war's aftermath was impossible to answer, but impossible to ignore. How many American soldiers had survived because they carried an M-one Garand instead of a bolt-action rifle? How many firefights had been won because American infantry could shoot faster? How many lives had been saved by that extra rate of fire? The numbers could never be calculated. Combat was too chaotic, too multifaceted, too dependent on countless variables. But military historians and veterans generally agreed that the M-one Garand had made a significant difference. Some estimated that the rifle's firepower advantage had saved thousands of American lives. Others suggested the number was higher. In the immediate post-war years, the Army conducted extensive debriefings with combat veterans, asking about their experiences with equipment and weapons. The responses regarding the M-one Garand were remarkably consistent. Soldiers trusted it, they relied on it, they credited it with keeping them alive. One veteran, Corporal Michael O'Brien, who had fought from Normandy to the Elbe River, expressed a sentiment that appeared in hundreds of debriefing reports. "I don't know if my rifle was better than the German rifle in accuracy or range or any technical measurement. All I know is that when I needed it to fire, it fired. When I needed 8 quick shots, I got 8 quick shots. It never let me down, and in combat, that's everything." This reliability, this trust, was John Garand's greatest achievement, not the technical sophistication of the gas system, not the manufacturing innovations, not the patents or awards. The achievement was building a tool that soldiers could depend on completely when their lives were at stake. In 1944, Congress finally recognized Garand's contribution with special compensation. After sustained advocacy from military officers and Springfield Armory colleagues, Congress awarded John Garand a payment of $100,000 in recognition of his rifle design. The payment represented a tiny fraction of the value his design had generated, but it was more than symbolic. It was an acknowledgement that his work had mattered. Garand accepted the payment with characteristic modesty. In a brief statement to the press, he said simply that he was grateful his rifle had served American soldiers well and honored that his adopted country had recognized his work. He donated a portion of the payment to establish a scholarship fund for children of Springfield Armory workers who had died in the war. The remainder he saved, living on his regular salary, as he always had. He continued working at Springfield Armory after the war, serving as a consulting engineer on various firearms projects. The Army was already developing the next generation of infantry weapons, selective fire rifles that could switch between semi-automatic and full automatic modes, new cartridges with different ballistic properties, new materials and manufacturing methods. Garand contributed to these projects, but his heart remained with the M-one. He spent considerable time working with Army training programs, ensuring that new soldiers understood how to maintain and operate the rifle properly. He visited military bases, spoke with soldiers, and listened to their feedback. He continued refining maintenance procedures and developing improved components. In 1953, at age 65, John Garand retired from Springfield Armory. He had worked there for 34 years, longer than most careers, longer than some lives. His retirement was marked by a formal ceremony attended by Army generals, government officials, and Springfield Armory workers. General J. Lawton Collins, Army Chief of Staff, presented Garand with the Medal for Meritorious Civilian Service, the highest award the Army could give a civilian employee. The citation praised his exceptional devotion to duty, outstanding technical competence, and significant contribution to national defense. In his retirement speech, Garand was characteristically brief. He thanked his colleagues, expressed pride in the soldiers who had carried his rifle, and noted that his greatest satisfaction came from knowing that his work had helped protect American lives. He did not mention the years of rejection, the dismissals, the skepticism. He did not dwell on the personal sacrifices or the financial compensation he never received for his patent. He simply expressed gratitude for the opportunity to serve. John Garand retired to a modest home in Springfield, Massachusetts. He lived quietly, occasionally consulting on firearms projects, but mostly enjoying the simple pleasures he had denied himself during his working years. Gardening, reading, walking through the town he had called home for over 3 decades. He never married. He remained a very private man, granting few interviews and avoiding publicity. When journalists or historians sought him out to discuss the rifle, he was polite but brief. He preferred to talk about the soldiers who had used the rifle rather than the engineer who had designed it. The M-one Garand remained in American military service long after John Garand retired. The rifle saw extensive use in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. American soldiers fighting in the frozen mountains of Korea carried the same rifle their fathers or older brothers had carried in World War II. The rifle performed as reliably in Korean winters as it had in European and Pacific combat. The M-one was not replaced as the standard United States infantry rifle until 1957, when the M14, a selective fire development of Garand's basic design, entered service. Even then, M-one Garands remained in use, with Reserve and National Guard units well into the 1960s. Some were still being used for ceremonial purposes and training in the 1970s. Over its production life from 1937 to 1957, approximately 6 million M-one Garand rifles were manufactured, 6 million copies of a design one immigrant machinist had developed in workshops and machine shops across 30 years. 6 million rifles that had armed American soldiers in World War II, Korea, and dozens of smaller conflicts. The rifle's influence extended beyond American service. Many Allied nations received M-one Garands through military aid programs. Italy, Japan, South Korea, and numerous other countries armed their militaries with Garands. The rifle became a symbol of American industrial and military power, a tangible representation of the arsenal of democracy. For firearm designers and military historians, the M-one Garand represented a watershed in infantry weapons development. It was the first semi-automatic rifle successfully adopted and deployed at scale by any military. It proved that semi-automatic operation was practical, reliable, and tactically valuable. Every semi-automatic and automatic rifle developed since World War II owes something to the M-one Garand's pioneering design. John Garand lived to see his rifle become a historical artifact, a piece of military history studied by new generations of soldiers and engineers. He died on February 16, 1974, at age 86, in Springfield, Massachusetts. His death received modest newspaper coverage, brief obituaries noting that the designer of the M-one Garand had passed away. There were no state funerals, no elaborate memorials. John Garand had lived modestly and died quietly, as he had always preferred. But among veterans of World War II and Korea, men who had carried the M-one Garand in combat, his death was noted with genuine grief. These men understood what Garand had given them, not just a rifle, but a tool they could trust completely, when trust meant the difference between life and death. In the decades since his death, John Garand's reputation has grown. Military historians recognize him as one of the most influential firearms designers in history. Engineering schools study his design process as an example of iterative refinement and practical problem-solving. The M-one Garand is displayed in military museums worldwide, often with explanatory plaques describing its revolutionary design and combat effectiveness. But perhaps the most meaningful tributes come from veterans themselves. Online forums and veteran organizations still share stories about the M-one Garand. Soldiers who carried the rifle 70 or 80 years ago still remember how it felt in their hands, how it sounded when it fired, how it never failed them when they needed it most. These memories, passed down through families and preserved in oral histories, are John Garand's real legacy. The story of John Garand and his rifle illuminates several truths about innovation, perseverance, and the relationship between individuals and institutions. Garand's design was rejected multiple times by the very institution that eventually adopted it. The experts told him his rifle was too complex, too expensive, unmakeable at scale. They were wrong, but they were not unreasonable. Innovation always seems impossible until someone proves it is not. Bureaucracies resist change because change is risky. Established procedures exist for reasons, and abandoning them requires courage and evidence. What made Garand succeed where others failed was not superior technical knowledge or better resources. Many designers were more formally educated, better funded, and more connected. What Garand possessed was absolute conviction that his design would work and the willingness to spend decades proving it. He did not argue with skeptics. He did not waste energy fighting bureaucracy. He simply continued working, building prototype after prototype, refining his design through endless testing. When the army finally adopted his rifle, it was not because he had convinced them through rhetoric. It was because the rifle worked better than the alternatives. The rifle proved itself. This is the pattern of genuine innovation. Convincing people through demonstration rather than argument. Building working prototypes rather than writing persuasive papers. letting results speak louder than credentials. Garand's personal sacrifice is also instructive. He devoted 28 years to a single project. He never married, had no children, built no fortune. He received modest compensation for work that generated billions in value. Some might view this as tragic, a talented man exploited by an indifferent bureaucracy. But Garand himself never expressed bitterness or regret. He had a different measure of success. His rifle had armed American soldiers, had helped win a war, had saved lives. For him, this was sufficient reward. This perspective seems almost incomprehensible in contemporary culture, where financial compensation is the primary measure of value. But Garand came from a different tradition. The immigrant tradition of gratitude, the craftsman tradition of pride in work itself, the citizen tradition of service to country. These values shaped his choices and sustained him through decades of difficult work. The question of what America owes to innovators like John Garand remains relevant. Should the government compensate inventors more generously for designs developed on government time? Should patent rights be more flexible when national security is involved? Should recognition be more forthcoming for individuals whose work proves crucial to national defense? These are complex questions without simple answers. But John Garand's story suggests that monetary compensation, while important, is not the only currency of value. Recognition, respect, and the knowledge that one's work mattered can be powerful motivators for people driven by purpose rather than profit. The M-one Garand's impact on World War II cannot be quantified precisely, but it can be assessed contextually. American infantry divisions in World War II had superior firepower compared to German, Japanese, or Italian infantry divisions. This advantage came from multiple factors, including more automatic weapons, better artillery support, and air superiority. But at the squad and platoon level, where most infantry combat occurred, the M-one Garand gave American riflemen a significant edge. German soldiers, armed with Mauser K 98 bolt-action rifles, could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute with practice. American soldiers with M-one Garands could fire 30 to 40 aimed shots per minute. In close-range engagements, this difference was decisive. In defensive fighting, it allowed smaller American units to hold positions against larger attacking forces. The strategic implications flowed upward from these tactical realities. American commanders could plan more aggressive operations because their infantry possessed firepower advantages. This influenced campaign planning, operational tempo, and ultimately strategic outcomes. Quantifying lives saved is impossible, but the directional impact is clear. More American soldiers came home because they carried weapons that gave them advantages in combat. John Garand's rifle was one of those advantages. As we reflect on this story over 80 years after the M-one Garand first saw combat, several lessons remain timelessly relevant. First, expertise and credentials do not guarantee correctness. The experts at Springfield Armory, who dismissed Garand's design, were knowledgeable, experienced professionals. They were wrong. The self-taught immigrant machinist with broken English was right. We should respect expertise while remaining open to insights from unexpected sources. Second, perseverance matters more than initial brilliance. Garand's first prototype was crude and unreliable. His breakthrough was not a single moment of genius, but 30 years of incremental improvement. Success came from sustained effort, not sudden inspiration. Third, serving something larger than yourself provides motivation that money cannot match. Garand worked for modest wages while developing a design that made others wealthy. He expressed no bitterness because his measure of success was impact, not income. Fourth, institutions are slow but not necessarily malicious. The Army's resistance to Garand's rifle came from legitimate concerns about cost, complexity, and reliability. When evidence demonstrated the rifle's superiority, the institution adapted. Patience and persistence eventually overcome institutional inertia. Fifth, simple solutions to complex problems often seem impossible until someone builds them. Stud welding. The semi-automatic rifle and countless other innovations were dismissed as unmakeable until someone made them. The lesson is to judge ideas by whether they work, not whether they seem feasible to experts. John Cantius Garand died 49 years ago, but the rifle that bears his name remains one of the most recognizable weapons in history. Museums display it, collectors treasure it, veterans remember it, and military historians study it as the weapon that changed infantry combat forever. The immigrant who arrived in America speaking no English, who taught himself engineering in machine shops, who was told his dream was impossible, proved that one person with a clear vision and unshakable determination can change history. His rifle armed the generation that saved the world from tyranny. His perseverance demonstrated that institutional rejection is not final defeat, but merely an obstacle to overcome. His legacy reminds us that the most important innovations often come from the least expected sources, and that serving something greater than yourself provides rewards that money cannot buy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.